Howdy, everybody. We are back. Dr. Wright and I are again sitting here, so blessed and excited to have Dr. Bagley talk to us right now. Talk to us about Chinese moral tradition. So to begin with, could we have you talk a little bit about led you to your interest and your experience with interest in and experience with Chinese moral traditions, Dr. Bagley?
Sure. So when I was in college, I took a course in Asian philosophy, and I read this. I had a really hard professor, and one of the things we had to do was read a book and come and talk to the professor about it for half an hour, and he would ask us questions, just one at a time, one-on-one. It was a great thing. And I read a book about contemporary developments in Buddhism, and it was a book. I read it and I reread it and I read it again, and I made all kind of little notes and went in, and it went pretty well. And I'm still in touch with that professor a little bit. He was very influential, a history professor. That's the earliest thing I can remember, being particularly interested about things in China. A lot of it was in developments in China. But several years ago, I had a chance to go to China on a faculty academic enrichment program. So I went with a group of faculty from around, I guess they were all from the United States. And we were studying the intersection between Tibetan Buddhism and environmental life. And so we started in Beijing with lectures and meeting a lot of people. Some of the lectures were in Chinese and translated to us, and that can be a little tedious, but we had good discussion times and everything. And eventually we got on the road. We were supposed to go to Lhasa and see the Potala Palace where the Dalai Lamas all lived until the current one left the country. And the guys arranging the thing botched it and didn't get us a travel permit, which was okay, because when my wife and I saw we were going, we decided to leave a month earlier and go spend some time in India and Nepal and China. And so we did all that kind of stuff for a month, spending some time in Delhi, hiking up in Nepal, up toward Mount Everest along a trail. And then we went and flew all around China. And one of the last things we did was take the 27-hour train ride up from Langzhou to Lhasa, where the Potala Palace is. Just a magical place. And it was, because it was the time of year it was close to the Dalai Lama's birthday, and Tibetans had been walking up the mountains and prostrating themselves on the road, and the temples were packed. Just an extraordinary experience. And then my wife had to go home because you can't bring a spouse on some of these things. And so I went and got the lectures, and then we got on the plane and the trains and moved all around the country. And one of the interesting things we did was go to an eco lodge near the foot of a glacier down in southwestern China. We had lunch in a yak herder's yurt. We had to wander through the corral to get into the yurt and sit on the carpets on the floor and eat yak yogurt and other good things that you wouldn't normally get. And we talked to a lot of Tibetan Buddhists about their faith, their life, and all that. So I came back, having learned a good deal about it and having fallen in love with Beijing. And 2 years later, took a group of Wingate students, and we went to Beijing, and we did the whole thing as I would do with history of religions. We went to the Confucian temple there. We went over to the Tibetan Buddhist temple. We went down to the Forbidden City to see the Chinese side of things, the political side of things. Went to the White Cloud Taoist temple not too far from the Forbidden City, and then down to Xi'an with all of the terracotta warriors. Did the usual tourist things, but focusing largely on the religious life of China. And then a couple of years after that, when we were sort of doing that in Korea with another group of Wingate students, a friend of mine arranged for me to go back to Shanghai and lecture on American philosophical ethics in one of the private universities over there. So I've gotten to go to China 3 different times and would go back in a heartbeat. It's an incredible, wonderful, and sometimes terrible kind of a place, and much to be learned. When you're dealing with religions, you must note, what happened in the 60s and 70s. Mao Zedong, the ruler, thought religion was basically a bad thing. Down there where you had all those Tibetan monks, about 1 out of every 10 guys was sitting in a monastery praying instead of out working the farm, and he thought that was very inefficient. So he did what he could to suppress religion. to convince people to give up the old traditions and just adopt the new kind of Maoist Marxist perspectives that he had, form the collectives and create more food and all of that, you know. So it was pretty heavy-handed for 10 years, and gradually it's gone away, but it's left its mark on the populace. A huge portion, maybe half or more of the populace, has very little to do with religion anymore. It's just not important to them. It kind of a big break, despite the kind of the rich religious tradition that's there in China. So we got through all of that, and in the course of that, then I think the best way to understand the religion that is left there and its residual effect is to know three specific traditions. Two of them are very old. Shall I go ahead with that now? Or did you have something else you want? Okay. Okay. So two of them are very old. Go back to 5th, 6th century BC, Taoism and Confucianism. Taoism is a very interesting ancient religion, although not a part of many people's current lives right now in as significant a way as it has been. It's often something that's credited as being founded by Lao Tzu or people in connection with Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu's legendary story is kind of funny. He was a wise man in a village. He got tired of people. He was convinced that most human beings are hypocritical, that human society is corrupt, that what he needed to do was to go out into the mountains by himself and figure out what he could do to achieve immortality. And the story goes that he was riding out of town on his ox, and when he got to the city gate, the fellow said, "Where are you going?" And he told him, and he said, "I will let you pass, but not until you write down the words of wisdom that you have attained." And that allegedly is where the Tao Te Ching came from. So that's the story, not regarded by many people as very reliable, but you know, it gives you a different perspective. And when you read the Tao Te Ching, and it's a delight to read. It's not long. It's beautiful poetry. It is very nature oriented. If you want to find out the truth, the reality that lasts, you're looking to nature. An interesting thing happened this year. One of Lao Tzu's, or in the Tao Te Ching, one of the favorite metaphors is water. Water is interesting because it kind of settles into the terrain in nature wherever you are. It fits in instead of trying to change it. And in a nation like ours, where we try to change everything, knock the mountains down, and plow, you know, all that's a kind of a stark contrast. But water is very powerful. You know, it carves canyons and washes huge things away because it is so powerful and to be respected. So there is you get the respect for nature with Taoism. But when you go to a Taoist temple now, you see a couple of things. You see beings that are sort of part human and part animal, you know, like human bodies and animal heads and so on. Yeah. And you have priests there who used to be old, but now they have younger priests. I think the testing program has changed. And you basically go in there to get them to divine your future or to give you advice about choices you're going to make. So it's sort of fortune teller functions that they have now. And when you go into one of the temples, that's what you see going on. So there's the natural side. The other side, and kind of a contrast to it then, is the side connected with Confucius. Confucius lived roughly at the same time as Lao Tzu, but he was much more optimistic about society. He did have a kind of a fixed idea about how society functions and how it functions best. So Confucius lived, give or take a little bit, about the same time as Lao Tzu, 5th, 6th century BCE. He was very different from Lao Tzu, in that he was more optimistic about the possibilities for human society. Lao Tzu just kind of gave up on human society and went off to the mountains and is allegedly still out there somewhere. Confucius, however, thought that what we needed to do was to learn how to be virtuous, learn how to engage in the rituals, learn how to respect people based on our relationships to them. And he thought the best way to have an influence then was to get employed by some leader, a governor, or preferably even an emperor or something, you know, but they didn't have emperors at that time. So but he didn't have much luck getting that kind of employment. But he did develop disciples who preserved some of his teachings. And now he's become kind of the primary name. When you speak about the classics of Chinese literature, they're called the Confucian classics, even the ones that have very little to do with Confucius himself. But there is this kind of trickle-down morality. If you want a nation to be good, the leader must be good. The leader must be wise and just so that things are done properly at the top. And if they are done properly at the top, then other people will function in more wise and just ways, and the nation will flourish. And of course, vice versa. If the nation is doing badly, you can be sure it's the fault of someone at the top, and for not being as careful as you're. But now those relationships we'll set aside for just a moment. The relationships to society in general, to participate in the rituals, the public recognitions, the rituals of mourning when someone dies, and all of that. The other side of Confucius's teaching that is still very influential, and not just in China, but in places like Korea and Japan, where Confucian teachings went, have to do with family structure. The primary relationship is between the elder male in the family and his oldest son. And that's the way the tradition gets passed. And everyone else is supposed to kind of be subservient to and show respect for those people. Now that sounds kind of cool and old-fashioned, but I have discovered from getting to know people that it still functions. We know a family in South Korea, for example, where the son and the daughter are both very accomplished professionals, but they did nothing in terms of going to school or applying for a job without checking with their oldest uncle, who at that time was the eldest man in the family. And not to do that is to show disrespect for the social structure. So that Confucian social structure is still alive and well in China and beyond, and maybe one of his his primary influences. And now that will come later into conflict with some of the modern concerns. So we've got Taoism, where there's a focus on nature as the source of all goodness and truth. Confucianism, where there's a focus on human relationships and being a virtuous, a good individual, wise and just, and so on. And then Buddhism comes across the mountains, from India and Nepal and Bhutan. It comes across into China and has a life of its own. So one of the major types of Buddhism is called Chan Buddhism. When it goes to Japan, it's called Zen Buddhism. Now, when I was talking to the monks, you wouldn't just obviously know that they were doing the same thing, but they do have some of the same traditions, the same kind of meditative traditions where they try to discover, the true inner self and develop the self in appropriate ways to get the Buddha nature out and so on. But the kind of Buddhism that we know more than that are the Tibetan Buddhists up in the Himalayan mountains in southwestern China. The Dalai Lama for more than 2 centuries. Well, it's sort of a semi-hereditary thing. When the Dalai Lama dies, they put one of the old monks in charge and they go looking to see where the Dalai Lama has been reborn. And they start looking a couple of years later with the help of soothsayers and astrologers and all. And that's how they found one. So the current one is number 14. And they found him by, he visited our campus. And when he was on our campus, one of my students asked him, he said, do you have any evidence at all that about your alleged reincarnation of this previous Dalai Lama? And everybody went, oh, it sounded impolite.
Yes,
I know. The Dalai Lama just laughed. He laughed so hard. He said, no, I don't have a bit. Not a bit. He said the only thing I could tell you is that some of the people who knew my predecessor and who knew me said we had certain personality traits that were similar. And
one of the things about him, if I may, is because I saw him speak when I was at Berkeley, and I tell you what, just the joy that bubbles up, though, the fact that you just said that does not surprise me. It's like a not taking yourself so seriously kind of energy, just a it's a good question. No, I don't,
Yeah, and as and maybe we would regard them as minor ethical issues. We didn't in Hinduism talk about the widespread vegetarianism, not absolute, because people in India who are poor will eat a fish when they have a chance because it's good, cheap, free protein in many cases. And in China, they're less likely to eat fish. and in Tibet, because as one of the fellows explained to me, they took us to a fish restaurant, and they caught the fish and cut it up right in front of us, and we ate raw trout over crushed ice. And I thought, this doesn't sound like a safe thing to do. But I asked him later, I said, this is the first time we've had fish anywhere in China. Why is that? And he said, well, you know, we're basing the Indian tradition where every life counts. And he said, every time you take a life, you sin. If you're going to eat fish, you take a lot of lives. If you're going to eat a buffalo, you can eat a long time with only the loss of one life. And so when we were way up in the mountains where it's sometimes hard to grow vegetables, we had more beef and buffalo and yak meat up there, you know. So they're just kind of an interesting minor effect of their lives in terms of vegetarianism, which often I've got vegetarians in my family, and it's not at all for the same reasons. But it's people who are vegan and vegetarian hold their belief in that very strongly sometimes. So.
And that's one of the things we're trying to do with our ethics kind of discussions and conversations. I know when we were speaking to your friend about Judaism, vegetarianism came up and how it connected or not connected with kind of religious values. So here it's the life, and we're so disconnected with our food sources that doesn't even register in a lot of our conversations in class. Other things register like carbon and you know, but it's very interesting. So we're in these conversations trying to connect values with action. Like, if you believe this, what are some of the actions that stem from it? So we love getting, and Paige, correct me if I'm wrong, that we love this personal encounter with the different religious traditions and art and travel and history, because it brings it alive and see how people are living out these different religions in different parts of the world, and how it can speak to some of the ethical dilemmas that we're going to talk to, I think, in a moment.
Yeah, okay.
That's my segue. That was so unsubtle, but.
Oh, do it. Well, then ask the question. Ask the question.
Oh, you do such a better job at it.
You're so funny. You're so funny. But it's interesting too, because you even in that moment, right, you're able to tie in how, like, just the actions that stem from these principles, right? So that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about also what you've talked about already in terms of the ecology, right? The ecological aspect of this, right? Especially when we think about Taoism, nature really being the source of truth and goodness, right? So maybe that would be one of the ethical dilemmas then, right? What do we do now with what's happening to our earth, right? With and I'm going to say it, with climate change, right? I mean, what then would be a response from the Chinese moral traditions to what is happening in our earth? And what do they have to say to us, to those of us who are sitting here in the United States of America that maybe are not as connected to or cognizant of how much we're interconnected, right? Yeah. What would you say, Dr. Bagley?
Well, I've you know, having named those kind of three religious traditions, which are ancient and so on, in China, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, you often run into people who don't really think of themselves as just one or the other, but they incorporate elements from all three. Buddhists are particularly good with funerals. You know? The Taoists are particularly good with telling your future and telling you what you need to worry about and so on. So it's but the Taoists are the ones who keep the nature-based part of that alive. And so what we found was maybe not a kind of an ardent social justice thing like we might do in this country when we're talking about environmental ethics. What we found was people who lived close to the earth. They lived simply, and in that respect, sort of kept alive the tradition, a lot of religious traditions, but particularly Buddhism and Taoism, living on the land. You know, when you can go out and hike for an hour or so from your lodge and actually climb up on the edge of a glacier, you know, you're way out in the boonies, and in a beautiful spot. And so it was more that, I think, the kind of the simple life, which many of the Tibetan Buddhists live. Many of them do not live in the Tibetan Autonomous Region anymore. They've moved out into other cities at lower elevations. Although a lot of them are coming back up to celebrate Buddha's birthday up there, or the Dalai Lama's birthday in May. So I can't, other than I mean, their respect is for souls for the most part, souls that are in animals and people. There's a little room in some forms of Hinduism to think about souls being elsewhere, plants and bugs and things, you know, that are that you don't normally interact with great seriousness. But for the most part, I think it's just preserving an old lifestyle of farming or living simply on the land. And much of China is not like that anymore. It's a big industrialized place where people leave their families and go hundreds of miles away for a job and send money back home and don't see their parents, and all of that disrupts this kind of respect for elders and caring for elders that's at the heart of, particularly, of the Confucian tradition.
Any thoughts, Kathy? Any follow-up question, just about ethical dilemma or whatever, you know, about any other ethical dilemma?
No, I think if you wanted to highlight anything, because I know you've taught the Height book a few times, you know, maybe one or two times. What kind of message would you give to the students about this chapter on Chinese moral tradition? Because I know it goes through both. Is there something you always love to highlight with your students?
Sure. Let me mention two things.
Perfect.
One of them is primarily about the religious life, not specifically about ethics. One of the things that happens in Buddhist temples is that many Buddhists in their temples bring in other local gods and goddesses. And so you go in and there is a depiction of one of the traditional characters, either Gautama Buddha, you know, from India, or Guanyin, who's a kind of interesting, somewhat feminine version of Buddha. Many of them think that Buddha was reincarnated as a woman at one point. There's Avalokiteshvara, the goddess of compassion, but she is one of the Buddhists, and the Dalai Lama and a couple of other lamas are actually partial reincarnations of the goddess of the Buddha of compassion. But there are these other gods and goddesses, and the question is, how do they function? Because Buddha himself may have been kind of non-theistic, we say. He seems to have thought that if they're gods, they're probably not much help to you. You really need to meditate and work out your own salvation, your own problems, discover your true Buddha nature within and manifest it in the way that you live. And yet most Buddhists are not that way. Most Buddhists do believe that there's external help available. Some of them have that kind of notion that something like karma, or maybe it's just good luck, that if you do something appropriate now, maybe you'll get a payoff soon, not having to wait to be reincarnated. And one of the most interesting things is in China, as in many countries around the world, the end of year tests for students are very important. They determine whether you can go into a higher school or you're going to go over to the trade school and learn how to lay bricks or something. And that makes a big economic difference in the student's life, but also sometimes in the family's life, if they're depending on one of the youngsters in the family, and sometimes there is only one youngster, to go on, get a good job and get money to help the family. And so on the days when the tests are being given, out on the street by the schools, there are parents out there, they're down there holding flowers. They just want their children to know that the parent is nearby and ready to greet them at the end of the day. And then down the street at the Buddhist temple, they're going around and they're putting money in front of the images of all these gods and goddesses, thinking maybe one of them is going to help my child do well on the test. And that strikes many people as a kind of an un-Buddhist way to deal with it. But religions do tend to have accretions from local culture. And so some of the Chinese gods and goddesses are there on the platforms, and just in case they can help. It won't hurt to throw a little money their way. And in some places more substantial offerings of food or even whiskey. In one place we saw one of the gods that likes whiskey, and all the little bottles lined up there. So that's kind of an interesting. The other thing that I think is of more ethical note, and Marie Height treats this at the end of the chapter, and she treats it very well, but it's so complex that sometimes people read it and don't capture it. So here's my interpretation of the last few pages of her chapter. What about the one-child policy? When people were starving in China and they thought the best way to handle the problem of a shortage of food was to sort of manufacture a shortage of people. and so limited people to one child. Here's the dilemma that she points out, but she does it over 3 or 4 pages. On the one hand, if you believe in Confucius, you think family is very important. And it's very important to have strong relationships between the parents and their children, and the grandparents and the grandchildren, the whole thing, the family. If you begin to undermine the ability to develop a family by restricting to one child, then you go against that strong family focus of Confucian teachings. On the other hand, if you really care about following the government and obeying the law and working for the good of your community and your country, you may think that it's, limiting birth is a good thing. I know plenty of people who still think that that's very important. Limit the number of children you have, and the earth will be better off thereby. But what this means is that among the people of China, there was this conflict between whether to go with developing a family with all those relationships, or whether to go with cutting back on family so that the nation itself is less likely to starve. Of course, now that we know the one-child policy has been revoked, limited significantly in almost all places, except where you've got a few old-fashioned officials who still want to stick with it, but when we were there, it led to a very interesting dynamic. Early in the 20th century, they started using the Western calendar. So Sunday afternoon is a good afternoon to go to the park. I mean, not that there are any Christian churches that you can see anywhere. I would sometimes ask, and they said, no, none around here. So, but you go to the park and people are picnicking and playing music and dancing and having a good time. And so you'll see families coming around, and here comes a stroller with a little child in it, and 2 parents, loving parents behind, and 4 grandparents. You've got these 6 adults going through the park with this one little baby who's going to get a lot of attention from those 6 adults. Everything about their family future is invested in that one child. And I'm sure that has good ramifications for the life and the well-being of the child, even if it strains the expectations of the family a bit. But it also led to the gender imbalance that we've talked about before in other settings. When there are places where also on the weekend, if you go through the park, there are these marriage markets. There are parents out there with pictures of their sons in particular, and they're looking for someone to come along, and they tell all about him, his education, his job, where he lives, show a picture if he's handsome, And in one place, they open their umbrellas and put the pictures on the umbrellas. And so here's this colorful line of umbrellas all around the park, and you could go through and shop for a son-in-law, see if you could find a good one there and make a deal with the parents. While they're not, China actually has a kind of a longer tradition than, say, India, of romantic love and choosing your own spouse and all of that. But still, parents can often play a critical role. If the son is off in some factory and can't meet anybody, or the same for the daughter, sometimes they can jump in there and help with the meeting an appropriate spouse.
Parents are wonderful, aren't they? They're always helping, trying to help. It actually puts a new spin on helicopter parents, umbrella parents, the new spin, just small one. Oh, this is wonderful. Paige, do you have anything you want to add, or?
No. I was actually just thinking about dating apps while Edwin was talking, and thinking about how you would do that, how parents would do that on dating apps. But anyhow, no, I have nothing to add, obviously. Thank you for sharing, though.
This was their version of dating apps, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think the one thing for me, right, the real ethical dilemma too is just thinking about how we understand. You were talking about souls, just the importance of souls, and so it's interesting to think about just this issue around gender and the gender of your child, and how children are seen, and just that binary and that hierarchy, and obviously being a feminist myself, that is something that, right, while trying to understand and respect another culture and understand that this is the way, this is a tradition for centuries, it's also, having grown up here in the United States and having been exposed to an education here and on the West Coast, I hear it and I'm like, wow, okay, how can I both honor this tradition and also just you know, my heart, right? It's hard, really. So to both respect and also to acknowledge discrepancies and yeah, discrimination. So that's where I am as we've been talking about this.
And it's interesting when you say souls, I also think of other than human. So my heart goes in also because in my upbringing and as an eco-theologian, looking at, you know, I loved how you brought in, you know, a fish that if you eat fish every day, that's so many souls compared to one buffalo and
Yeah.
yet other than human, the
Non-human animals.
yeah, the other than human is something that I think we don't have in a lot of the religious traditions, and if we're going to use that binary east and west, and that comfort with thinking about the souls of fish, yet the souls of fish is not something we talk about in other traditions. So I was really, so it's, and all our listeners out there, all our viewers in our different classes, you might take different things away from all of these conversations, and that's the point. I think the point is that we bring ourselves to all these conversations. We look at values and what forms and informs these values, and then how we act on them. So we're so grateful, and we don't ever get enough of Dr. Bagley. There's
So true.
There's never enough Dr. Bagley. And so we thank you so much for doing this with us. It's been the most joyful hour and a half because we had 2 sections, but 2 sections with Hinduism and Chinese moral traditions. And I hope COVID is over soon so we can come visit.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.